Cole Hendricks drove the axe down so hard, the blade bit clean through the log and buried itself in the stump beneath. He didn't stop. He split another, and another. Because up the road, 4 men were dragging an old woman's trunk out into the dirt, while the whole town watched and did nothing. Ruth Vance stood in the middle of it, chin up, not one tear falling. And Cole knew that look. He'd worn it himself 20 years back the day he chose to stay silent. Before we go on, if you believe a good person deserves a second chance, subscribe. And stay with this story to the very end. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see how far this story travels. The morning Ruth Vance came back to Cutbank Valley, nobody rang a bell. Nobody needed to. Word traveled faster than any church bell in a town that size, and by the time the stage rolled to a stop outside the mercantile half of Cutbank, had already gathered on the boardwalk to see the woman they'd sworn they'd never see again. Cole Hendricks wasn't among them. He was 3 miles up the mountain mending a section of fence a bear had torn through in the night, and he'd have stayed up there all summer if he'd had his way. He had come down off that mountain exactly 4 times in 10 years, and each time he'd regretted it. People in his long experience were the one animal you could never fully break to the halter. A horse you could trust. A dog. A good rifle. But a man would smile at you Sunday and cut your fence Monday, and a town full of them was just a bigger version of the same lie. So when he finally did ride down that afternoon out of flour, out of coffee, out of patience with his own cooking, he had no notion that the day would change the shape of the rest of his life. He heard the crowd before he saw it. No place for her here and there never was. Somebody ought to tell her the stage runs back out at 4. Somebody ought to have told her 20 years ago. Cole slowed his horse to a walk. He didn't like crowds. A crowd was a thing with no eyes and no conscience, and it always found a smaller thing to turn on. He'd seen it in mining camps and cattle towns from Texas to the Bitterroots, and it always looked the same. A ring of people. And in the center, someone alone. He reined up at the edge of it and looked over their heads. The someone alone was a woman. Older, near 60, he'd have guessed, in a gray traveling dress gone thin at the elbows, standing beside a single leather trunk with both hands folded in front of her like she was waiting for a train that was never coming. Her hair had gone silver, pinned back plain. Her face was lined, and her chin was up. That was the part Cole noticed. The chin. A woman that age, standing in the middle of a town that plainly hated her with not one friendly face in a crowd of 50, she had every reason in the world to bow her head, to cry, to beg. And she was doing none of it. She stood there like a fence post, driven deep, and she looked each of them in the eye one at a time, as if daring them to say to her face what they were saying behind their hands. Cole knew that look. He knew it the way you know your own reflection. "You've got no business back here, Ruth Vance." The voice belonged to a heavy-set man in a banker's black coat sweating through it in the July heat. Cole didn't know him. 10 years off the map will do that. Whatever brought you, you can carry it right back out on the 4 o'clock. "I've a right to be here, same as anyone, Mr. Pruitt." Her voice was steady, low. "This was my family's land before it was your bank's. That was settled in a court of law." "It was settled," she said, "in a room full of men who were paid to settle it." A murmur went through the crowd, not sympathy. The other thing. The sound a crowd makes when someone says the quiet part out loud. "You watch that tongue," Pruitt said. "You watch it, or so help me." "Or what?" She took a half-step toward him, and it was such a small thing, that half-step, but the banker rocked back on his heels, like she'd swung at him. "You'll do what you did to my husband. You'll do what you did to my boy. Your husband was a thief." "My husband," she said, and her voice cracked, for the first time, one crack quick, hammered flat again before it could spread, "was an honest man that you and Harlan Doyle put in the ground with a lie." Cole's hands went still on the reins. Harlan Doyle. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in 20 years. He'd worked hard not to. He'd built a whole life up on a mountain out of not hearing it. And now here it was, said plain in the middle of a July street by an old woman standing beside a trunk, and something turned over in his chest that he'd thought was long dead and buried. "You're upsetting these good people," Pruitt said, recovering, playing to the crowd now. "You've got no kin here, no friends, no welcome. There's nothing in Cut Bank for you but grief, and I'd think a woman your age had had enough of that." "You'd think a lot of things, Mr. Pruitt. 4 o'clock. He turned to the two men beside him, young, thick-necked, the kind of men who did other men's ugly work for wages. "Boys, her trunk's in the way of decent folks. Set it down by the road where she can wait for her stage." They took hold of the trunk, and Ruth Vance put herself between them and it. "That's mine." "Move aside, ma'am." The taller one barely looked at her. "I said that's mine. 40 years my mother carried her linens in that trunk. You'll take your hands off it." They didn't. One of them just set a hand flat on her shoulder to move her the way you'd move a gate, and she staggered back a step and caught herself, and the crowd laughed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough that the sound of it carried. Cole was off his horse before he knew he'd decided to be. He didn't remember dismounting. He remembered walking. He remembered the crowd parting, because a man that size, walking with that much purpose, will make a crowd part, whether it wants to or not. And he remembered the two thick-necked boys looking up as his shadow fell across them. And he remembered his own voice coming out low and flat and strange in his own ears. "Take your hand off her." The boy looked up, squinted. "This ain't your affair, mister. I'm making it my affair. Take your hand off her, or I'll take it off you at the wrist." He said it quiet. That was the thing about Cole Hendricks that men who didn't know him always got wrong. They heard the quiet and mistook it for weak. The boy let go of Ruth's shoulder, but he squared up chest out the way young men do when they've decided they can't back down in front of a crowd. "You know who we work for. Don't much care. We work for Mr. Doyle." "Then you can tell Mr. Doyle," Cole said, "that Cole Hendricks is back in the valley. See if the name still means anything to him." Something changed in the crowd then. A ripple. A shift. Cole heard his own name repeated back through it. "Hendricks. Hendricks. That's Hendricks." Come down off the mountain, and he understood all at once that he'd been a story in this town for 10 years without ever knowing it. The wild man on the ridge. The one who never came down. The one who never smiled. The banker Pruitt had gone a shade paler. "Now, Mr. Hendricks, there's no call for—" "She keeps her trunk." Cole didn't look at him. He was looking at Ruth Vance, and Ruth Vance was looking at him. And there was something in her face he couldn't read. Not gratitude, not yet something warier than that. Something that had been lied to too many times to trust the first kind thing it saw. And if she wants to stay in this valley, she stays. Anybody's got a problem with that, they can bring it to me. She has nowhere to stay, Pruitt said, almost pleading now. The hotel won't take her. The boarding house won't. She'll stay at the old Vance place, Cole said. The silence that dropped over the street then was a different kind of silence. That land belongs to the bank, Pruitt said. That land, Cole said, is standing empty and has been for years, and there's a cabin on it that's still got a roof, and I don't recall the bank ever finding a use for it except to let it rot as a monument to how it got took. She'll stay there. You want to run her off it, you send your boys up. He turned finally and looked at the two thick-necked men and let his gaze rest on each of them in turn until they found somewhere else to look. You send 'em up and see what comes back down. Nobody moved. Ma'am, Cole said, you able to travel? Ruth Vance looked at him for a long moment. Then she bent, took one handle of the heavy trunk, and started to lift it herself. Cole took the other end before she'd raised it an inch. I've got it. I didn't ask you to. No, ma'am, you didn't. He hoisted it onto his shoulder in one motion, 40 years of a dead woman's linens, and it was nothing to him. And he carried it to his horse and lashed it behind the saddle, while the whole town of Cutbank stood on its boardwalk and watched and said not one more word. And when he was done, he held the stirrup for her. She looked at it. I don't need helping onto a horse. Never said you did. Then why are you holding the stirrup? 'Cause my mother raised me to, Cole said. You can climb up however suits you. I'll just be standing here holding this in case. For half a second, just half something moved at the corner of her mouth that might on a better day have been the ghost of a smile. Then it was gone. She set her foot in the stirrup, and she climbed up behind the trunk, and Cole took the reins and led the horse out of town on foot walking, because a man doesn't ride while a woman his elder rides double behind his gear, not if his mother raised him right. They were a quarter mile out of Cutbank before either of them spoke. "You'll want to turn around," Ruth said, "before this costs you something." "Little late for that." "You don't know what you stepped into back there." "I know exactly what I stepped into." Cole didn't turn around. He kept walking, kept the horse moving at an easy pace, kept his eyes on the road. "I stepped into Harlan Doyle. Reckon I've been walking around him for 20 years. Figured it was about time I stopped." He felt her go still behind him, felt it in the horse, even the way a rider's stillness travels down through the animal. "How do you know that name?" "Everybody in this valley knows that name." "Not the way you said it," Ruth said. "You said it like it cost you something to say." And Cole Hendricks, who had not told the truth about that name to a living soul in 20 years, found that he couldn't lie to the back of this old woman's head on an empty road in the July heat. So he said nothing at all, which she was too sharp not to notice, and they walked the rest of the way to the old Vance place in a silence that had far too much in it. The cabin was worse than he remembered. 10 years of nobody and 10 more years of Doyle letting it rot on purpose had done their work. The porch sagged. 2 windows were gone. There was a bird's nest in the stovepipe, and a good part of the roof had opinions about staying on. But the walls were sound, and the door still hung, and Cole had built more out of less. "It's a ruin," Ruth said, standing in the yard with her hands folded again. She didn't sound like she was complaining. She sounded like she was doing arithmetic. "It's a roof. It's a bird's nest with a floor. I'll have the stovepipe clear by dark and the worst of the roof by tomorrow." Cole set her trunk down inside the door and straightened. "You got money for supplies?" "I've got enough." "That's not what I asked." "It's the answer you're getting." Cole almost smiled. Almost. He caught it in time. "All right," he said. "I'll bring down what you're short. You can call it a loan and pay me in whatever you've a mind to. But you're not spending your first night back in the valley eating cold beans in a cabin with no fire, so I'll be back before dark with an axe and a load of dry wood, and you can argue with me about it then." "I don't want charity, Mr. Hendricks." "Good," Cole said, "'cause I've got none to give. Charity's for folks who feel sorry for you. I don't feel sorry for you at all, ma'am. Feel sorry for anybody dumb enough to try and take your trunk." She looked at him, and this time the ghost of the smile got a little further before she killed it. "Go on then," she said, "before I change my mind about you." He came back before dark as promised with a mule loaded down dry, split pine, a sack of flour, coffee salt pork, coal oil, a coil of new rope, and a paper of nails. He came back the next day too, and the day after that. He cleared the stovepipe, and mended the roof, and reset the porch posts, and hung the 2 missing windows with glass. He rode all the way to Miller's Crossing to buy, because Cutbank's Mercantile had suddenly discovered it was out of everything a man named Hendricks might want. And every day Ruth Vance told him she didn't need help, and every day she was standing in the yard when he rode up. By the end of the first week, the town had a name for it. He heard it from a freighter on the Miller's Crossing road, heard it delivered as a joke, the kind of joke that's really a warning. "Old Ruth Vance had a keeper," the man said, grinning. "The mountain man. Doyle's not happy about it. You be careful up that way, friend." Cole didn't answer him. He just tipped his hat and rode on. But the name stuck in him like a splinter under a nail all the way up the mountain, because he knew what a name like that meant. A name like that meant the town had decided how the story went. And once a town decided how a story went, it would burn the whole valley down before it let the story go any other way. He'd learned that 20 years ago. He'd learned it standing in exactly the spot Ruth had stood in that first afternoon, the middle of a Cutbank street, a crowd all around, and in the center of it, a man on his knees. Silas Vance, Ruth's husband. Cole had been 19 years old and green as spring grass, hired on at Doyle's outfit for wages, and he had watched Harlan Doyle stand up in front of the whole town and swear that Silas Vance had forged the water rights that stood between Doyle and the richest bottomland in the valley. And Cole had known the way you know your own name that it was Doyle who'd done the forging, because Cole had seen the papers on Doyle's own desk before they ever went to the county seat. Cole had seen the ink still wet, and Cole had said nothing. He'd been 19, and he'd been poor, and Doyle had looked at him one time, one long look across a lamplit room, and Cole had understood exactly what would happen to a 19-year-old ranch hand with no kin and no name if he opened his mouth. So he'd kept it shut. He'd taken his wages, and he'd watched them take Silas Vance's land and Silas Vance's good name, and he'd watched Silas Vance die of a broke heart inside 2 years, and he'd watched Ruth Vance and her boy get run out of the valley with nothing. And then Cole had done the only honest thing his coward's conscience could manage. He'd quit. He'd drawn his last wages from Doyle, and he'd ridden up the mountain, and he'd built a cabin as far from every human soul as a man could get, and still be in the same county. And he'd stayed there for 2 decades, telling himself that a man who kept to himself and hurt nobody was as close to a good man as he had any right to be. That the silence was in the past. That the past stayed where you left it. And now the past had come back on a 4 o'clock stage and asked him to carry its trunk. She didn't know. That was the thing that ate at him worst those first 2 weeks. Ruth Vance had no earthly idea who he was. To her, he was just the strange mountain man who'd stepped out of a crowd, the one decent soul in a town of buzzards. She didn't know that 20 years ago he'd stood in that same crowd. She didn't know that if a green ranch hand had found his spine on a certain July afternoon, her husband might have died, an old man in his own bed, and her boy might have grown up on his own land, and she might never have spent 20 years scraping by in other people's towns being called a thief's widow. She didn't know that the man mending her roof was the man who could have saved her whole life and hadn't. He almost told her a dozen times. He'd get the words halfway up his throat, and then she'd say something dry and sharp that made him want to laugh, or she'd hand him a cup of coffee without a word of thanks, and the words would sink back down. Because he was a coward. He knew that about himself now, plain as he knew the mountain. He'd been a coward at 19, and he was a coward at 39, and the shape of the cowardice had changed, but the animal underneath it hadn't. At 19, he'd been afraid of Doyle. At 39, he was afraid of the look that would come into Ruth Vance's face when she learned the truth. So he kept mending the roof. It was the 14th day near the end of it, the light going long and gold across the valley when it happened. He'd split a good cord of wood for her that afternoon. She'd been out with a hatchet doing it herself, when he rode up a woman near 60, swinging a hatchet at green pine, and it had put a kind of quiet fury in him that he couldn't fully explain that she should have to, that nobody in 20 years had ever thought she shouldn't have to, and he'd taken the axe out of the woodshed without a word and worked until the pile was higher than her waist and his shirt was soaked through. She came out onto the mended porch with 2 cups of coffee, set one on the rail beside him, watched him bring the axe down a last time, and set it in the chopping block. "You'll wear yourself out," she said. "I'm all right. A man your age." "I'm 39, ma'am." Same thing. But there was warmth under it now, the first he'd let himself hear. 14 days had worn something down in her, some outer wall, and what showed through the gap in it was a woman who had once a long time ago known how to be teased. She looked at the woodpile higher than her waist, enough dry pine to see her through to the first snow split by a man she'd known 2 weeks who wouldn't take a cent for it. And something crossed her face, something soft and sad and almost young. "You know," she said, "my Silas used to chop the wood." Cole went still. "First winter we were married, we hadn't a stick between us. He chopped wood till his hands bled. I bandaged 'em up every night, and he'd be back at it come morning." She wrapped both hands around her cup. 40 years ago. Lord, 40 years. She was quiet a moment. Then she looked at Cole, and the sad thing in her face turned at the very last second into something braver. A joke, because a joke was the only way a proud woman had ever learned to carry grief without setting it down where anyone could see. "Where were you 20 years ago, Mr. Hendricks?" A woman could have used a man who chops wood like that. Where were you 20 years ago? She meant it kind. She meant it as the closest thing to affection. A heart that guarded could offer a joke, a light thing, a small gift of warmth handed across a porch rail in the gold evening light. She had no idea. She could not possibly have known. It was the gentlest thing anyone had said to Cole Hendricks in 10 years. And it went into him like a knife between the ribs, because he knew exactly where he'd been 20 years ago. He'd been standing in a cut-bank street with his mouth shut. He set down the axe. His hand wasn't quite steady, and he made it steady, and he picked up the coffee she'd set on the rail, so he'd have something to do with the hand, and he could not look at her. He looked at the woodpile. He looked at the mountain going dark. He looked anywhere but at the face of the woman whose whole life he could have saved and hadn't, and who had just, out of the goodness of a heart the world had spent 20 years trying to kill, made a soft joke about wishing he'd come along sooner. Mr. Hendricks. The warmth in her voice pulled back wary again, quick to sense a wrong step. I didn't mean anything by it. It was only I was here. It came out of him before he could stop it. Quiet. Flat. The truth after 20 years, and it didn't feel like relief. It felt like the first bone breaking. You were where? 20 years ago. Cole set the coffee down. He turned and made himself look at her. Made himself, because a coward could at least stop being a coward for the length of one sentence. And he owed her at least the sight of his face when she heard it. You asked where I was 20 years ago, ma'am. I was here, in this valley. I was working for Harlan Doyle. He watched it reach her, watched the warmth go out of her face by degrees, like the light off the mountain, and something colder and older come up behind it. A lot of men worked for Doyle, she said carefully. I saw the papers, Ruth. He'd never called her by her name before. It was always ma'am. It fell between them now, and neither of them moved. I was 19 years old, Cole said, and I was in Doyle's office the week before your husband's trial, and I saw the water rights on his desk, with the ink still wet, and I knew that it was Doyle forged them, and not Silas. I knew it. And when they stood your husband up in that street and called him a thief in front of the whole town, I was standing in that crowd. His voice did not shake. He wouldn't let it. He owed her a steady voice. And I said nothing. I took my wages, and I said nothing, and I let them bury an honest man under a lie, because I was too scared of what Doyle would do to me if I opened my mouth. The coffee cup slipped out of Ruth Vance's hands and broke on the porch she'd watched him mend. Neither of them looked at it. You knew. Her voice had gone to almost nothing. All this time, all these weeks, you knew, and you chopped my wood and you fixed my roof and you let me make a joke about, I should have told you the first day. Why didn't you? Because I'm a coward, ma'am. Cole's jaw was tight. I was a coward at 19, and I'm a coward now, and the only difference is that at 19 I was scared of Doyle, and now I'm scared of you, because I knew this is exactly how you'd look at me, and God help me, I wanted 2 more weeks of you looking at me the other way before I lost it. Ruth Vance stood on the porch of the cabin her family had lost, and she looked at the man who could have saved it, and for a long, long moment, she said nothing at all. Her hands had begun to shake. She folded them the way she folded them, the way she'd folded them in the middle of that street, with the whole town against her. And Cole understood now that the folding of the hands was a thing she did to keep from breaking, a small brave habit built up over 20 years of having no one to catch her if she fell. Get off my land, she said. Ruth. It's not your land, she said, and it's not my land, because men like you let men like Doyle take it. And now the only thing on this earth that's mine is the right to tell you to get off it. So get off it, Mr. Hendricks. A tear went down her face at last, the first he'd seen, and she didn't wipe it, and somehow that was worse than if she'd wept. Get off it and go back up your mountain and be a coward where I don't have to look at you. Cole picked up his hat off the chopping block. He didn't argue. There was no argument. Everything she'd said was true, and a man who'd spent 20 years running from a truth doesn't get to stand and quarrel with it the first time it looks him in the eye. He put his hat on. He went down the porch steps he'd rebuilt with his own hands. He got on his horse. And at the edge of the yard he stopped, because he found there was one thing left in him that had to be said, coward or not. "You're right about every word," he said, not turning around. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm not. But I'll tell you this, and then I'll go and I won't trouble you again unless you send for me. 20 years ago I was too afraid of Harlan Doyle to do the one thing that would have saved your husband. And I have hated myself every single day since up on that mountain alone the way a coward's supposed to." He looked back at her, then over his shoulder, and his eyes were wet and his voice was not. "But I'm not 19 anymore, and Doyle's not the only one who came back to this valley. So you go on and hate me, ma'am. You've earned it. But you should know that the man who was too scared to speak 20 years ago is about done being scared, and Harlan Doyle is about to find that out." He rode up the mountain in the dark, and behind him on the porch of the cabin her family had lost. Ruth Vance stood a long time in the last of the light, one hand pressed flat against her mouth, staring after a man who had just handed her in a single evening both the worst wound of her life and the first true weapon anyone had offered her in 20 years. She did not call him back, but she did not. When the dark came, throw his coffee cup off the porch. She picked up the pieces, and she carried them inside, and she set them on the shelf. She didn't send for him. 3 days went by, and Cole Hendricks stayed on his mountain, the way a man stays inside a wound, and every hour of every one of those days he told himself the same thing, that she'd earned her silence, that he owed her that silence, that the kindest thing a coward could do for the woman he'd failed was stay gone. He believed it in the mornings. By the afternoons he believed it less, and on the third night he was standing at his window, looking down the black shoulder of the mountain toward the one small light that was her lamp 3 miles off and flickering, and he found he could not make himself go to bed, because a man had ridden up to Miller's Crossing that afternoon with news. Doyle knew. Cole had heard it from the same freighter who'd first told him about the joke going around town. The man had come up the mountain road with a load for the Peterson place, and he'd stopped where Cole was mending harness by the trail, and he'd said it plain the way men say a thing they know is trouble but can't keep behind their teeth. "Doyle's asking after you by name Hendricks." "Is he? Says there's a fella up on the ridge got a long memory and a short future." The freighter hadn't smiled saying it. "I'd watch the road up here is all. Man like Doyle don't ask after a fella by name for the pleasure of the conversation." Cole had thanked him and gone back to his harness, and his hands had been steady the whole time, and the freighter had ridden on believing the mountain man hadn't a nerve in his body. But Cole had sat there a long while after the sound of the wagon died, holding a strap he'd forgotten he was holding, and what he'd felt wasn't fear. That was the strange part. 20 years he'd carried around a fear of Harlan Doyle so old and so deep it had become the shape of his whole life, and now that the man had finally said his name out loud like a threat, the fear wasn't there. What was there was worse, because if Doyle knew Cole was back, and Doyle knew Cole was fixing the Vance place, then Doyle knew where Ruth Vance was sleeping. And a man who would forge water rights and let an innocent man die of it was not a man who'd lose a night's sleep over an old woman alone in a cabin at the far end of the valley. So Cole didn't go to bed. He saddled his horse in the dark, and he rode down off his mountain with a rifle across the saddlebow, and he came to the edge of Ruth Vance's yard some time past midnight, and got down and did not go to the door. He wasn't fool enough to think she'd open it to him. He just tied his horse in the trees, where it couldn't be seen from the road, and he sat down against the trunk of a pine with the rifle across his knees, and he watched the road into the yard. And he kept watch the way he'd kept watch over cattle in wolf country 20 years back. Still as a stump and twice as patient. He was still there when the sky started to gray, and he was still there when the cabin door opened and Ruth Vance came out with a shawl around her shoulders and a shotgun in her hands, and pointed it dead at the pines where he sat. "I know you're out there," she said. "I've heard your horse blow twice. Come out where I can see you, or I'll put a load of shot into the trees and hope." Cole stood up slow, empty hands first, then the rifle held down and away. "It's me, ma'am. I can see that." She didn't lower the shotgun. 3 days had put something new in her face. Not softness, the opposite of softness. a kind of hard, bright wariness that made her look 10 years younger and twice as dangerous. "What in God's name are you doing sitting in my trees in the middle of the night?" "Doyle knows I'm back," Cole said. "And he knows where you are. I wasn't going to have you sleeping out here alone with that man knowing where to find you. So I sat in your trees. That's all it was, Ruth. I sat in your trees and I watched your road, and I'd have gone before light and you'd never have known, except your ears are better than I gave 'em credit for." She looked at him a long moment down the barrel of the shotgun. Then she lowered it, not all the way, just enough that it pointed at his boots instead of his heart, which for Ruth Vance was as close to a welcome as a man had any right to expect. "You've got some nerve," she said. "Yes, ma'am, I know it. Fixing my roof and hiding what you are, and then sitting in my trees like some kind of, I don't even have the word for what you are." "Coward's the word you used last time," Cole said. "It still fits." Something flickered across her face, at the plainness of it, the way he wouldn't argue, the way he just picked up the ugliest word she had for him and agreed to it. She'd spent 3 days building a wall against the sound of him defending himself, and he'd walked up and refused to defend himself at all, and now the wall had nothing to lean against. "Coffee's on," she said finally, and turned back toward the door, and didn't say he was welcome to it, and didn't say he wasn't. Which Cole understood. He followed her up the porch steps he'd rebuilt, and he leaned his rifle by the door, and he came into the cabin where a woman he'd wronged 20 years ago poured him a cup of coffee at dawn and set it down in front of him, hard enough that some slopped over the rim. They sat across the table from each other, and neither drank. "Say your piece," Ruth said. "You've been wanting to say something for 3 days. I can see it on you. So say it and be done, and then we'll decide what happens after." Cole turned the cup a quarter turn on the table, turned it back. "I've been trying to figure," he said slowly, "how to be sorry to you in a way that means anything. And I can't. That's the truth of it. There's no sorry big enough for what I did, and I know a sorry's the cheapest thing a man can offer, so I'm not going to sit here and hand you one and act like I've done something. Sorry's for stepping on your foot. I didn't step on your foot, Ruth. I helped Harlan Doyle take your whole life." She sat very still. "But I'll tell you what I can do," Cole went on, "because I've had 3 days up on that mountain to think about it, and I've thought about nothing else. I can't give you back your husband. I can't give you back the 20 years. I can't undo 1 minute of what I let happen in that street. But I know what Doyle did. I know how he did it. And there is one man left alive in this valley who saw those papers with the ink still wet, and that man is sitting at your table drinking your coffee." He looked up at her. "Doyle got away with it because there was never a soul who'd stand up and say what he did. Well, now there's a soul. And he knows it. That's why he's asking after me by name. Because for the first time in 20 years, Harlan Doyle is afraid of something, and the something is me." The room was quiet. "You'd testify," Ruth said slowly. "I'd do more than testify. I'd stand up in front of the whole valley that watched them break your husband, and I'd tell them every word of what I saw and what I knew and what I didn't say. And I'd let them look at me while I did it, and I'd let them know exactly what kind of man kept his mouth shut for 20 years, and I would not spare myself 1 inch of it." His jaw worked. "It won't clear my name. I don't want my name cleared. But it might clear his. Silas's. It might put it back the way it was supposed to be, so that when folks say the name Vance in this valley, they say it with respect again, instead of with a wink. That's the only thing I've got to give you, Ruth. It's not enough. Nothing's enough. But it's what I've got, and it's yours if you want it." Ruth Vance looked at him for a long, long time, and then she did something Cole did not expect. She laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was low and tired, and it had 20 years of bitterness folded into it, and when it was done, there was a wet shine in her eyes that she blinked hard against. "You think it's that simple," she said. "You stand up, you say your piece, the wrong gets righted, and the mountain man rides off feeling clean. Is that the story you've been telling yourself up there? No, I don't feel clean. I'll never feel. You don't understand what Doyle is." Her voice cut across him flat and hard. You worked for him 20 years ago when he was a young man, clawing his way up with one forged deed and a lot of nerve. He's not that anymore, Mr. Hendricks. He owns the bank, he owns the freight line, he owns the man they made judge, and he owns the man they made sheriff, and half the men who'd sit on any jury you dreamed of owe him money or owe him fear. You want to stand up in front of the valley and tell your truth. Fine, he'll let you. And then he'll destroy you the way he destroyed my Silas. And it won't take him 2 years. This time it'll take him 2 weeks, and I'll have gotten one more good man killed by standing too close to me. Her hands were flat on the table now, pressed down hard, the knuckles pale. So no, you don't get to ride down here at midnight and sit in my trees and make me a hero and make yourself a redemption, because I have buried the only man who ever loved me. And I have watched my son grow up ashamed of a name he never should have been ashamed of, and I am too old and too tired to bury anybody else. Do you hear me? I won't do it. I won't stand at another graveside because a good man got brave 20 years too late. Cole was quiet. Where is he? He said finally. Where's who? Your boy. Ruth's face closed like a door. That's none of your... You said he grew up ashamed of the Vance name, Cole said. You said it like a thing that's still happening. So where is he, Ruth? Because a man that knows Doyle for what he is and knows the wrong that was done and stays away, that's a man carrying the same rock I've been carrying. And I'd know that rock anywhere. For the first time since he'd known her, Ruth Vance looked away from him. Denver, she said. Last I knew, he took a different name. He was 14 when we left here, old enough to remember the whole of it, old enough to hear what they called his father in the street. He couldn't carry it. I don't blame him. He begged me for years to give up on this place on Silas's name, told me to let it go. Told me the dead don't care about their names. Her voice thinned. We had words, bad words. He said if I kept coming back here to fight a war, I couldn't win. He'd have no part of it. That was 6 years ago. I haven't heard his voice since. She pressed her lips together. So you see, Mr. Hendricks, when you talk about clearing Silas's name, you're a little late to be the first man to think of it. His own son gave up the name to be rid of the shame you helped put on it. That's what Doyle took. Not just a husband, not just some land. He took a family and cut it clean in two, and I've spent 6 years unable to so much as write to my own child because he can't stand to be reminded I exist. And there it was, the wound under the wound. Cole had come down the mountain thinking Ruth's grief was for a dead man. It was worse than that. It was for a living one. Somewhere in Denver there was a man who'd cut off his own mother rather than carry his father's name. And every day Ruth Vance stayed in this valley fighting for that name was a day she chose a dead husband's honor over a living son's peace, and it was killing her by inches, and she'd never once let a soul see it. What's his name? Cole said quietly. The name he took. Why? Because if I'm going to break Harlan Doyle, Cole said, I'd as soon do it in a way that brings your boy home. Ruth Vance stared at him, and whatever she might have said, she never got the chance, because that was the moment they both heard it, horses on the road. More than one. Coming fast in the gray morning light, coming right up the road to the yard, and Cole was on his feet with his hand already reaching for the door and the rifle beside it before the first rider came into view. Get away from the window, he said. It's my house. Ruth. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But something in the flat quiet of it moved her, and she stepped back from the window, and Cole put himself in the doorway with the rifle held low and ready, and he watched 3 riders pull up in the yard. He knew the 2 thick-necked boys from the street. The third man he didn't know, but he didn't have to. Some men you can read off a horse from 40 feet. This one sat his saddle easy and expensive. A good coat, a good hat, a face gone soft and heavy with 20 years of getting his way, and eyes that hadn't gone soft at all. Eyes like 2 nails. Harlan Doyle had come to see the ghost for himself. Well, Doyle said, and his voice was pleasant, genial, the voice of a man who owned the ground he sat his horse on. They told me and I didn't believe it. Cole Hendricks. In the flesh and holding a rifle in a dead man's doorway just like old times. He smiled. You've got gray in your beard, son. The mountain's been hard on you. Harlan. That's Mr. Doyle to most folks now. You're not most folks to me, Cole said. You're the man whose ink I watched dry. Guess we can both skip the pleasantries. Doyle's smile didn't move, but something behind the two nails of his eyes flickered just once, and Cole saw it, and understood that Ruth had told him the plain truth. This was a man afraid. He'd hidden it under 20 years of ownership, and it was buried deep, but it was there, and Cole had just put his thumb square on it. I'll tell you why I rode all the way out here, Doyle said. Man my age, my position doesn't ride out to the far end of the valley at dawn for his health. I came because I'm a reasonable man, Cole, whatever you might think of me, and reasonable men settle things before they turn ugly. He leaned on his saddle horn. You've been down off your mountain 2 weeks, and you've made yourself a nuisance. Fixing up property that isn't yours. Sheltering a woman that's got no business in this valley. Saying my name in a tone I don't much care for. Now I could make all that a great deal harder for you than it needs to be, or... He let it hang. Or you could take a sum of money, a generous sum, more than that mountain's worth more than you've seen in 10 years, and you could ride south, and this whole unpleasantness could be behind us before the sun's full up. What do you say to that? How much? Cole said. He felt Ruth go rigid behind him. He didn't turn around. Now that's the Cole I remember. Doyle's smile widened, warm with relief, because a man who asks the price is a man who's already halfway bought, and Doyle had spent his whole life buying men. $2,000, gold, in your hand by noon. All you do is get on that horse and ride and forget you ever knew a name called Doyle. $2,000, Cole repeated. He appeared to think about it. He turned the idea over the way he'd turned the coffee cup. That's a lot of money for one old man's silence. It's a lot of money for a fresh start. No, Cole said. It's a lot of money for silence, Harlan. And you'd know because you paid it once before, only that time you paid it in a look across your office and a 19-year-old boy too scared to earn wages any other way. You didn't even have to spend the gold that time. My silence was free. He shifted the rifle easy, not a threat, just a man settling his grip. Well, here's the difference 20 years makes. 20 years ago, my silence was the cheapest thing you ever bought. And now, he looked Harlan Doyle dead in the two nails of his eyes. Now it's the one thing in this whole valley you can't afford. The yard went very still. The two thick-necked boys had stopped grinning. One of them let his hand drift toward his hip, slow, and Cole watched it drift without appearing to, and the boy thought better of it and let it drift back. You're making a mistake, Doyle said. All the genial warmth had gone out of his voice. What was left was the thing that had always been underneath it. You had one chance to walk away clean, and you just used it up. I'm going to tell you how this goes now so there's no confusion later. That woman behind you is going to be off my property inside the week one way or the other, and you're going to wish you'd stayed on your mountain and let the past lie where honest cowards let it lie. He gathered his reins. You always were a coward, Cole. You proved it 20 years ago. A leopard doesn't change his spots because he grows gray in the beard. When it comes down to it, you'll fold the same as you did then. You haven't got the sand to do anything else. And that was Harlan Doyle's mistake. Because Cole Hendricks stepped down off the porch one slow step, then another, and he walked out into the yard until he was standing beside Doyle's horse, looking up at the man close enough that the two thick-necked boys both went for their hips at once, and Cole didn't so much as glance at them. He looked up at Harlan Doyle, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet, the boys had to lean to hear it. You're right about one thing, Cole said. I was a coward. I've been a coward 20 years. And you built your whole life on the fact of it, on knowing I'd never say a word, on knowing there wasn't a man in this valley with the sand to stand up to you. He let that sit. But you made one mistake, Harlan, and it's the same mistake all your kind make in the end. You spent 20 years telling me I was a coward, until I believed it so deep I gave up my whole life to it, went up a mountain and hid. And a man who's already lost his whole life to being a coward, you can't threaten him with losing it. There's nothing left to take. You understand what I'm telling you. You've got no hold on me. Not money, not fear, not a thing. Because the worst you can do to me, I already did to myself 20 years ago in that street. He stepped back. So do your worst. Send your boys. Send the law you own. I've been dead 20 years already, Harlan. You can't kill a dead man twice. But I can sure as hell take you down into the ground with me, and I aim to. For one long moment, nobody in the yard breathed. Then Harlan Doyle laughed, but it came a half-second too late, and it was a half-tone too high, and every man in that yard heard the crack in it. He wheeled his horse hard. "Inside the week," he said, and it was almost a shout, now all the smoothness gone. "You hear me, old woman? Inside the week." And he spurred out of the yard with his two boys behind him, and Cole Hendricks stood in the settling dust and watched him go and did not move until the sound of them had died all the way off down the road. Then he heard Ruth behind him. She'd come out onto the porch. She was gripping the rail with both hands. "Do you know what you've just done?" she said. Her voice was shaking. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? I turned down $2,000. You spat in the face of the most dangerous man in 3 counties. She came down one step. "He'll kill you. You made him look small in his own valley in front of his own men, and a man like that would rather die than look small, so he'll make sure it's you that dies instead. You've signed your own, Ruth." Cole turned around. "Look at me." She looked at him. "Did you hear his laugh?" She didn't answer. "You did. I saw you hear it. That laugh came a half-second late, Ruth. 20 years I served that man, and I never once heard his laugh come late. That's not the laugh of a man who's won. That's the laugh of a man who just found out the one thing he was counting on isn't there anymore." Cole came toward the porch. "He's been able to run this valley for 20 years on one thing above all others that everybody who could hurt him was too scared to try. And this morning in your yard, he found out there's a man who isn't scared anymore, and he doesn't know what to do about it. You saw it. He rode out of here yelling like a boy. That's not strength. That's a man whose whole game just changed, and he knows it. That doesn't make him less dangerous," Ruth said. "It makes him more." "Yes," Cole said quietly. "It does. You're right about that. A cornered animal's the most dangerous kind there is. So we've got to be smart, and we've got to be quick, and we can't do it alone. A truth told to an empty valley isn't worth anything. It's got to be told to enough people, that Doyle can't buy them all or scare them all." He set his jaw. "Which brings me back to the thing I was asking you when he rode up. Your boy, his new name. Because I've been thinking on it, and I think I know how we do this. Not with a trial, not first. Doyle owns the court, you said so yourself. You don't beat a man like Doyle in a room he owns. You beat him in the one room he doesn't." He pointed off down the valley toward the town. "You beat him in the street, the same street where they broke your husband. You get up in front of the whole valley in the open where he can't control it, and you tell the truth so loud and so plain that even the men who owe him money have to look at it. And if there's a witness standing there beside you, a witness who worked for Doyle who saw the ink dry, then it's not a widow's grievance anymore. It's testimony. It's the thing Doyle spent 20 years making sure would never exist." Ruth was quiet a long moment. "And my son, if we do this," Cole said, "if we clear Silas Vance's name in the open street of the town that ruined it, then somewhere in Denver, there's a man who took a false name to hide from a shame that was never his to carry, and that shame comes off him. And maybe, Ruth, I'm not promising, I've got no right to promise you anything, but maybe a man like that reads in a paper that his father's name was cleared, and his mother did the clearing, and he starts to think about coming home." He watched her face when he said it. He watched hope try to get into Ruth Vance's face, and he watched her fight it because hope was the one thing that had hurt her worse than anything Doyle had ever done, and she'd learned 20 years ago to bar the door against it. But it got a foot in anyway. He saw it. A crack in the wall. "Daniel," she said finally, very quietly, like the name cost her something to say aloud. "He calls himself Daniel Reese now. Reese was my mother's people." Her voice caught. "He was Samuel Vance. He gave up his own father's name and his own Christian name both to be shut of us. Daniel Reese." She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, then took it away. "You want to know the worst of it, Mr. Hendricks? I don't even blame him. That's the worst of it. I've never once blamed my boy for wanting to be free of a name that got spat on in the street. I'd have done the same at 14. I've spent 6 years hating myself for being the one who wouldn't let it go, wondering if I'm keeping faith with a dead man, or just too stubborn to admit the dead man's fight is lost." She looked at Cole, and her eyes were wet and fierce all at once. "And now you ride down off your mountain and tell me it's not lost. After 20 years. You tell me there's a way, and God help me. I want to believe you, and wanting to believe you is the most frightened I've been since the day they buried Silas." "Then be frightened," Cole said. "Be frightened and do it anyway. That's the only kind of brave there is. I found that out this morning in your yard. I was scared to death walking up to that horse. Did it anyway." He held out his hand to her, not to help her down the step. She was 2 steps up. It wasn't for that. He just held it out open across the space between them. "I can't do this without you, Ruth. It's got to be you. You're the one they wronged. A witness is nothing without the widow standing beside him. So I'm asking you not to trust me. You'll never trust me, and you shouldn't. I'm asking you to use me. Use the coward who watched them break your husband. Let me be the weapon you never had. It's the one honest thing I've got left to give, and I am giving it to you with both hands." Ruth Vance looked at his open hand for a long time, and she didn't take it, but she came down the last 2 steps and stood in front of him, closer than she'd ever stood, and she looked up into his weathered face with those fierce wet eyes, and she said, "If we do this, and Doyle kills you for it, and he'll try, make no mistake, he'll try. I want your word on one thing." "Anything." "When it's done, when Silas's name is clean, you go to Denver yourself." Her voice shook but held. "You find my boy, and you tell him what you did and what you failed to do, all of it, no sparing yourself. And you tell him his mother never blamed him, not once, not for one single day. Because if this costs you your life, Mr. Hendricks, then I'll not have you die with your redemption half finished. Clearing a dead man's name is only the half of it. The other half is bringing a living son home. You give me your word you'll do both, or I'll not stand in any street with you." Cole Hendricks looked at the woman he'd failed 20 years ago, standing close enough to touch, asking him with her whole broken heart to promise he'd finish mending a family he'd helped break, even if the mending cost him everything. "You have my word," he said. "Both halves. Living son and dead man both. I swear it on the 20 years I owe you." And Ruth Vance at last took his hand. They didn't shake it like a bargain. She just held it a moment, her thin, strong fingers around his 2 people who'd each lost their whole lives to the same man 20 years apart. And it was not affection, not yet. It was too soon and too raw for that. But it was the first thing that had ever passed between them without a wall behind it. And when she let go, something had changed in the air of the little cabin yard. Some weight had shifted, and both of them felt it. "All right," Ruth said, and wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist, brisk and businesslike, the tears gone as fast as they'd come. "All right. If we're going to do a fool thing, we'll do it right. Sit down. Drink your cold coffee. And tell me exactly what you saw on Harlan Doyle's desk 20 years ago. Every word. Every mark. Because if I'm going to stand in that street, I'll want to know your testimony better than you know it yourself. And then we'll talk about who in this valley might stand with us. Because you're wrong about one thing. Mr. Hendricks, you keep saying I've got no friends here. I've got no friends who'll say so out loud. That's a different thing. There's folks in this valley owe Silas Vance a debt they've been too ashamed to pay for 20 years. Maybe it's time somebody gave them the chance. Cole followed her back into the cabin, and he sat down at the table, and for the next 2 hours, he told her everything. He told her about the office and the lamp and the papers with the ink not yet dry. He told her about the look Doyle had given him, and exactly what it had said. He told her about the trial, the parts he'd stood in the crowd for who'd spoken, and who'd stayed silent. And Ruth listened with a stillness that was terrible. Her hands folded on the table, taking it all in, the way a woman takes in the details of the worst day of her life, told back to her by the one man who could have stopped it. Twice she had to get up and stand at the window a while before she could go on. Once she wept silently, without covering her face, and Cole stopped talking and waited, and did not reach for her, because he understood he had not yet earned the right to comfort a grief he'd helped make. And by the time the sun was full over the valley, they had the shape of it. They would send word to the men and women Ruth named quietly one at a time, the folk who'd owed Silas, and been too afraid to say so. They would set a day. On that day, they would stand together in the open street of Cutbank, in front of the church, where they'd broken Silas Vance, and Cole would tell what he saw, and Ruth would tell what was done, and the debtors would stand up one by one and say the true thing they'd been ashamed to say for 20 years. And they would do it in the open, where Doyle's bought court and bought sheriff couldn't twist it in front of enough witnesses that the truth once said could never be unsaid. It was a mad plan. Cole knew it was a mad plan. Doyle would not stand by and let it happen. There would be blood before it was done, most likely his, and he'd made his peace with that in the yard that morning, standing beside a killer's horse with nothing left to lose. But there was one thing about the plan that Cole did not tell Ruth Vance. One piece he kept behind his teeth as he rode back up his mountain that evening. One piece he turned over and over in the long dark. Because when Ruth had spoken her son's new name, Daniel Reese of Denver, something had gone cold and still in Cole's chest. Some memory shaking itself awake after a long sleep. Daniel Reese. He knew that name. He'd seen it. Not in Denver. Here. In this valley. On a paper. Recent. And he could not for the life of him remember where, but he knew it the way you know a face in a crowd before you can place it, and it sat in him all the way up the mountain like a coal that wouldn't cool. Ruth's son had taken the name Daniel Reese to hide in Denver 6 years ago. So why in God's name had Cole Hendricks seen that same name written down somewhere in Cutbank Valley, and why did the memory of it fill him, for reasons he could not yet name, with a dread far colder than anything Harlan Doyle had brought into that yard at dawn? It took him 3 days to remember, and when he remembered, he wished to God he hadn't. He was up on the mountain splitting wood he didn't need, because splitting wood was the thing his hands did when his mind wouldn't settle, and somewhere between one swing and the next, it came to him whole. The land office at Miller's Crossing. 4 months back. He'd ridden over to file the annual paper on his mountain claim, the same tedious paper he filed every summer, and while he'd stood at the counter waiting for the clerk to find his file, he'd let his eyes wander over the ledger left open on the desk. New filings. New purchases, and a name partway down the page in a clerk's tidy hand, D. Reese. A parcel bought, bottomland, in Cutbank Valley. Cole set the axe down and stood very still in the yard. Daniel Reese had bought land in the valley his mother thought he'd fled. For a long moment, Cole let himself believe the innocent thing that the boy had come back quiet, that he'd bought a piece of his home ground under his new name, meaning to surprise her. That any day now Samuel Vance would ride up that road and take his mother in his arms, and the whole thing would mend itself without a shot fired. Cole wanted that to be true so bad he could taste it. He held on to it the length of one long breath. Then his mind, the cold, careful mind that had kept him alive alone on a mountain for 10 years, asked the question he didn't want asked. Whose bottomland? Because there was only one man in Cutbank Valley who held the good bottomland, the land he'd stolen from Silas Vance with a forged deed 20 years ago, and had been squeezing money out of ever since. Harlan Doyle. And if Daniel Reese had bought bottomland in the valley, he'd bought it from Doyle, which meant Ruth's son, the boy who'd cut off his own mother, rather than carry his father's shame, had come back to this valley in secret and done business with the very man who'd destroyed his family. Cole didn't want to believe it. He rode down to Miller's Crossing that same afternoon to prove himself wrong. He was not wrong. The clerk was a young fellow new since Cole's last visit, and he had no reason to be careful around a big, quiet mountain man who filed his claim polite and paid his fee in coin. Cole let him find the mountain claim first, made the small talk a man makes, and then said easy, like it hardly mattered. "Fellow named Reese buy in around here lately, Denver man. I heard he might be looking to sell, and I've got a cousin asking after bottomland. Reese." The clerk turned pages. Reese. Here. D. Reese, yes. Bought the old Vance bottom off Mr. Doyle back in the spring. Whole parcel. Paid cash, the record says, which is a rare thing these days. The clerk looked up helpful. "But I don't believe he's selling. Way I heard it, he and Mr. Doyle have got some kind of arrangement going. Bigger plans for that bottom land. Some railroad business folks say, though. I couldn't tell you the particulars." Cole kept his face still. 20 years of hiding things had made that easy. "Railroad," he said. "That's the talk. Mr. Doyle and the Reese fellow thick as thieves this whole spring, in and out of the office together. You'd think they'd known each other years." The clerk shrugged and closed the ledger. "Anyhow, was there anything else, Mr.?" There was not. Cole rode back up his mountain in the dark with the coldest weight he'd ever carried sitting square in his chest. Because now he understood the whole shape of it, and the shape of it was worse than anything he'd feared. Ruth's boy hadn't come home to mend a family. He'd come home to do business. He'd sat across a table from the man who murdered his father in all but the deed, and he'd bought back the family land. Not as a son, reclaiming his birthright, but as a partner, buying in, and he'd done it under a false name, so that not even his own mother, living not 10 miles off, chopping her own firewood, dreaming every night of the day her son might forgive her, would ever know he was there. And Cole Hendricks now had to decide whether to tell her. He didn't sleep that night or the next. On the third night, he made up his mind, and it was the hardest thing he'd chosen since he'd chosen to walk up to Doyle's horse. Because a coward's way would be to keep it from her, to let her stand in the street and clear Silas's name, still believing her son was an innocent boy, hiding from shame in Denver, and to spare her the second wound. But Cole had spent 20 years learning what silence bought a man, and he'd sworn to himself in her yard that he was done buying anything with it. She had a right to know, even this, especially this. So he rode down the mountain at first light, and he found her already up, already out, already swinging that hatchet at Green Pine like the valley itself had wronged her. And he took the hatchet out of her hands the way he had the first time, and he said, "Ruth, sit down. I've got to tell you a thing, and it's going to hurt you, and I'd give my right arm not to be the one telling it." Oh, boy. She went white. She thought it was Doyle. She thought somebody was dead. "It's about your son," Cole said, and he told her. He told her all of it, plain no sparing, because sparing was just another word for cowardice, and he was done with it. He told her about the ledger 4 months back, and the ride to Miller's Crossing, and the clerk's words. He told her the boy had bought the Vance bottom off Doyle in the spring cash under his false name. He told her about the railroad talk, and the in and out of the office together, and the thick as thieves, and he watched every word land on her like a blow, and he did not stop until she knew everything he knew. Ruth Vance did not weep. That was the thing that frightened Cole most. He'd expected weeping. He'd braced for it. He could have borne it. What he could not have braced for was the way she went perfectly terribly still. Her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, her face draining of everything until it was as blank and gray as the day they'd carried Silas out. She sat like that so long, Cole began to fear something in her had broken past mending. "Ruth," he said quietly. He shook that man's hand. Her voice came from very far off. "Doyle put my Silas in the ground, and my boy my Samuel." He sat down at a table and shook that man's hand and called it business. She was quiet again. Then still in that faraway voice, "Do you know what I've done for 6 years, Mr. Hendricks? I've stayed. Everyone told me to leave, my own son begged me to leave, and I stayed in this valley because I couldn't bear to walk away from Silas's name. And I told myself all this time that I was keeping faith for the both of us, for me and for Samuel. That somewhere out there my boy still believed his father was innocent, still carried it, still cared even if he couldn't say so. That was the thing that kept me here, not the land, not even Silas. God forgive me. It was the idea that my son still believed. She looked up at Cole, and her eyes were dry, and that was the worst of it, bone dry and empty. And he doesn't. He came back here, and he made a deal with the devil that killed his father, and he didn't so much as ride 10 miles to see was his mother alive or dead. So, you tell me, Mr. Hendricks. You tell me what I've been keeping faith with, because it wasn't a son. The son I was keeping faith with never existed. Cole knelt down in front of her chair. He didn't touch her. He just got down where she could see his face. You don't know why he did it, he said. Ruth, you don't know his reasons. A man can shake a hand for 100 reasons, and only one of them is that his heart's turned. Maybe it's turned. I won't lie to you and say it can't be. But maybe it's something else. Maybe he came back for a reason we can't see yet, and maybe... Don't! Her voice cracked like a whip. Don't you do that? Don't you sit there and hand me hope like it's a kindness. Hope is the thing that's kept me on my knees in this valley for 6 years. Hope is what Doyle uses. Hope that the court might be fair. Hope that folks might speak up. Hope that my boy might come home. That's the rope they've hanged me with, one strand at a time, my whole life. I am done with hope, Mr. Hendricks. I want the truth, or I want nothing. She stood up, and her legs weren't quite steady, and she steadied them by will alone. So here's the truth. My husband is dead. My son is bought. And the only living soul in this whole valley willing to stand beside me is the coward who watched it all happen and did nothing. She laughed, and it was an awful sound. That's the family Harlan Doyle left me. A dead man, a traitor, and you. That last word hung in the air between them, and Cole took it the way he'd taken coward without flinching, because it was earned. All right, he said low. Then let's you and me, the coward and the widow, go and clear the dead man's name anyhow. Not for the son, for Silas, for the truth of it. Because whatever your boy's done, Silas Vance was innocent, and that's a true thing. And true things ought to be said out loud, whether anybody's left alive to be glad of them or not. Ruth looked down at him a long moment. Get up off the floor, she said. I don't need a man kneeling to me. Never have. But her voice had come back from the far-off place, some of it. And when Cole stood, she put her hand flat on his chest for just a second, just once over the heart, the first time she'd touched him of her own will. You're a hard man to hate, Cole Hendricks. I've been trying for 3 weeks and I can't get it to hold. And that was the thing that undid him worse than any curse, that after everything, she couldn't hold the hate. He had to turn away and busy himself with the hatchet, so she wouldn't see his face. They set the day for that Sunday. It was Ruth's choosing. Sunday, when the whole valley came into Cutbank for church, when the street would be full, and Doyle's bought sheriff couldn't very well arrest a widow for speaking in front of every soul in the county. They spent the 4 days before, it moving quiet as they could, riding out one at a time to the folk Ruth named the Petersons, who Silas had grub-staked through a hard winter and never asked back a dime. Old widow Hallett, whose husband Silas had pulled from a flooded creek at the cost of his own broke ribs. The storekeeper Aldous Finch, who'd sold Doyle's boys the rope 20 years back and never forgiven himself for it. A half-dozen others, all of them carrying the same 20-year-old shame like a stone in a boot. And to every one of them, Ruth Vance said the same words, plain no begging. This Sunday I mean to stand in the street and say what Doyle did. There's a witness now, a man who saw. I'm not asking you to fight. I'm only asking, when I've said my piece, that you stand up and say the true thing you've been ashamed to say. That's all. Just stand up. Some of them wept. Some of them wouldn't meet her eye. Aldous Finch shook so hard he had to sit down. But not one of them said no. And Cole, watching from a little way off, hat in hand, saw a thing he'd forgotten a valley could do, saw the shame that Doyle had used as a chain for 20 years begin one frightened soul at a time to turn into its opposite. Because shame kept private eats a man alive. But shame that gets to become courage out loud, alongside others carrying the same, that's the thing that burns a valley clean. They rode home separate the night before, so as not to be seen together on the road. And it was that night alone in her cabin, with everything set, and the die about to be cast, that Ruth Vance heard a horse in her yard for the second time. She thought it was Cole. She went to the door with the lamp. It was not Cole. It was a man of maybe 30 well-dressed town clothes, dust of hard riding on them, sitting a good horse at the edge of her lamplight with his hat in his hands, and his face turned half away, like a man who couldn't quite bear to be seen. And Ruth Vance stood in her doorway, holding the lamp up, and the light fell on that half-turned face, and the lamp near dropped out of her hand. Because even at 30, even in town clothes, even after 6 years, a mother knows the shape of her own child's face in the dark. "Samuel," she said. The word came out of her broken. "Mama." His voice was a stranger's, and not a stranger's deeper than she remembered, roughened. "Don't." He got down off the horse, awkward like his legs didn't want to hold him. "Don't call me that, please. Not yet. I haven't got the right to it yet. Let me say what I came to say first, and then you can call me whatever you decide I am." Ruth Vance stood frozen in her own doorway, with the lamp shaking in her hand, and 6 years of grief, and 4 days of new betrayal, and a whole lifetime of holding herself upright, all colliding in her chest at once. And she did the only thing left to a woman with nothing to lose. She said the cruelest, true thing she knew. "I know what you did," she said. "I know you bought your father's land off the man who murdered him. I know you've been thick as thieves with Harlan Doyle all spring, under a false name, 10 miles from your own mother, and you never came. So don't you stand in my yard with your hat in your hands and mama on your lips, Samuel Vance. Whatever you came to say, I already know the shape of it, and it's rotten." The young man flinched like she'd struck him, but he didn't leave. He stood there and took it, and Ruth saw in that, in the taking of it, in the not leaving the ghost of the boy, she'd raised the boy Silas had raised, who'd been taught that a man stands and takes what he's got coming. "You know the shape of it," Samuel said quietly, "but you don't know the inside. Mama, Mrs. Vance, I bought that land off Doyle for one reason, and it wasn't the reason you think." He took a step closer into the lamplight, and now she could see his face full, and it was not the face of a traitor. It was the face of a man who hadn't slept in weeks, who was carrying something too big for one set of shoulders, and who had ridden a long way in the dark to set it down. "I didn't come back to make a deal with the man who killed my father. I came back to hang him, and I need your help to do it, and I've been too much a coward to ask until tonight, and I think, Mama, I think there's a man in this valley been helping you, a big quiet man off the mountain, and if he's who I think he is, then God help me. He's the only other person alive who can prove what I've spent 6 years finding proof of." Ruth Vance did not move. She could not. "6 years ago, you and I had words." Samuel went on faster now. "The dam broken, the words pouring. And I told you to let it go, and I meant it. God forgive me, I meant it. I wanted to be shut of the name, and the shame, and all of it. And I went to Denver, and I took a false name, and for a while I was free of it. And I hated myself for being free of it, because every night I dreamed of Papa on his knees in that street. And I couldn't help it. I started asking questions. Quiet ones. About Doyle. About how a man builds an empire off a single stolen deed. And Mama, the more I dug, the more I found. Doyle didn't stop with us. He's done it to a dozen families across 3 counties. The same trick, the same forged papers, the same bought court over and over for 20 years. And it's all connected now to this railroad deal. And there are records. There are men who kept records to protect themselves. And I have spent 6 years and every dollar I ever made buying and stealing and copying those records, building a case so big and so plain that not even a bought judge could bury it." His voice broke. "But I needed to be inside. I needed Doyle to trust me. So I came back under my false name, and I bought our land off him. And I smiled, and I shook his hand, and I let him believe I was just another greedy man wanting in on the railroad money. And it is the worst thing I have ever done. Shaking that hand, Mama, it near killed me every time. But I did it because it was the only way to get close enough to finish him. And now I'm close enough, and I can't do the last of it alone." Ruth Vance had begun silently to weep. Not the dry, frozen grief of 3 days back. Real tears pouring 6 years of them, because the son she'd told herself never existed had just ridden out of the dark to prove her wrong, in the most terrible and wonderful way a mother's heart can be proven wrong. "You never turned," she whispered. "You never turned at all. You've been fighting him this whole time, alone. And I called you bought. I called you a traitor. 3 days ago I sat in that chair and I said the son I kept faith with never existed. You had every reason to think it." Samuel's own eyes were streaming now. "I made sure you'd think it. I couldn't risk you knowing, Mama. Don't you see, if you knew, you'd have looked at me different in the street. And Doyle watches you. Doyle's always watched you. And one wrong look between us, and he'd have known, and it all comes apart. I had to let you hate me. I had to let my own mother believe I'd sold my father's memory. It's the price of it. It's the price of getting close to a man like that." He was close enough now to reach her, and he didn't. He stopped, just short hat still in his hands, waiting because a boy who'd hurt his mother this deep didn't get to close the last of the distance himself. "I came tonight because it's almost done, and I couldn't let you go one more day thinking what you were thinking. And because tomorrow I heard Mama. I heard you mean to stand in the street tomorrow, and you can't, not the way you're planning. You'll get yourself killed and ruin everything, because Doyle knows something's coming. He's been jumpy for weeks, ever since that mountain man turned down his money. You know about that? Doyle talks when he's scared. He told me about it himself. Some ghost off the ridge who worked for him 20 years back wouldn't take 2,000 in gold." Samuel searched her face. "That's the man been helping you, isn't it? That's the witness. Mama, who is he? Because if he worked for Doyle 20 years ago, then he might be the one thing my 6 years of records can't give me. Papers can be called forged. A judge can be bought to doubt a ledger. But a living man who stood in Doyle's office and saw the ink dry with his own eyes, a man who'll swear to it in the open, that's the keystone. That's the thing that makes the whole case unbreakable. Who is he, Mama? Tell me his name." And Ruth Vance stood in her doorway, her son found, and her heart cracked wide open with joy and grief together, and she opened her mouth to say the name Cole Hendricks, and then she stopped, because she understood all at once the thing she was about to do. She was about to bring together in one room the son who'd spent 6 years building a case to hang Harlan Doyle, and the man whose single act of cowardice 20 years ago had let Doyle build the empire in the first place. She was about to introduce her boy to the coward who could have saved his father and hadn't. And she did not know, could not know whether Samuel, learning the truth of what Cole was, would embrace the witness he so desperately needed, or draw a gun and finish the man he'd have every right in the world to hate. "His name," Ruth said slowly, "is Cole Hendricks. And before you meet him, Samuel, before you say one word to him, there is something you have to know about who he was 20 years ago in this valley. Because the man who's going to save us all, the witness your whole case turns on, is also the man who could have saved your father's life and chose to keep his mouth shut instead. And I need to know, son, before I bring you two together tomorrow, whether you're the kind of man who can use a coward to catch a devil, or whether the sight of Cole Hendricks is going to make you do something that costs us everything we've both bled for." Samuel Vance went very still in the lamplight, and far off up the black shoulder of the mountain, Cole Hendricks sat alone at his window, looking down at the one small light that was Ruth Vance's lamp. Unaware that a second horse stood in her yard, unaware that Ruth's lost son had come home, unaware that by this time tomorrow the boy whose father he'd failed would be standing in front of him with the truth in his hands and murder or mercy still undecided in his heart. Samuel Vance was quiet a long time in the lamplight, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone flat and careful, the voice of a man walking out onto ice. "Say that again," he said. "Say the part about my father. Slow." "Samuel, you said this man could have saved him." Samuel's hands had gone white around the brim of his hat. "You said he could have saved Papa's life and chose to keep his mouth shut. I want to hear it again. Mama and I want to hear it plain, because I have spent 6 years imagining every face that stood in that crowd and did nothing while they broke my father and I need to know if the man you've been trusting is one of them." Ruth Vance looked at her son, and she understood there was no soft way through it, and she'd sworn off soft ways 3 weeks ago on a porch. "He worked for Doyle," she said. "He was 19. He was in Doyle's office the week before the trial, and he saw the forged water rights with the ink still wet. And he knew it was Doyle's forgery, and not your father's. And when they stood, Silas up in that street, Cole Hendricks was standing in the crowd. And he said nothing. He took his wages, and he said nothing, and then he quit and rode up a mountain and hid from it for 20 years. She held her son's eyes. "That's who he is, Samuel. That's the witness. That's the man whose word can hang Doyle. He is also the man who could have stopped all of it before it started and didn't." Samuel turned away from her. He walked to the edge of the lamplight and stood with his back to her, and his shoulders were shaking, and Ruth couldn't tell if it was grief or rage, and she suspected it was both. "All these years," Samuel said low, "all these years I told myself, if I ever found even one of them, one man who knew and stayed quiet, I'd make him answer for it. I built that into my bones. And now you're telling me the one witness I need to finish Doyle, the keystone of 6 years of work, is that exact man." He laughed, and it was a terrible sound, worse than his mother's. "God has a cruel sense of humor, Mama. He surely does." "Samuel, what am I supposed to do?" He rounded on her, and his eyes were wild now. "I've dreamed about that man's face for 6 years, and I didn't even know it had a name. And you want me to stand next to him in the street tomorrow. You want me to shake his hand. You want me to build my father's justice on the word of the coward who let him die." His voice broke wide. "How do I do that? How does a son do that?" And that was when Cole Hendricks spoke from the dark at the edge of the yard. "You don't have to," he said. Both of them spun. Neither had heard the horse Cole had left it back in the trees and come the last 100 yards on foot, the way he'd learned to move in wolf country, because he'd seen the strange horse in the yard from up on his mountain, and come down fast and quiet with his rifle, not knowing it was friend or foe. He'd meant to come in ready for Doyle's men. Instead, he'd come in on the last of it, and he'd heard enough standing in the dark just past the light to know exactly what he'd walked into. He stepped into the lamplight with his hands empty and his rifle left behind in the grass, and he looked at the young man who was Ruth's son and Silas's son both, and something in his weathered face just seemed to give way, some last wall he'd been holding up for 20 years. "You're Samuel," Cole said. "You've got your father's jaw. I stood close enough to Silas Vance in that street to know his jaw." He took his hat off. He didn't often take his hat off. He held it against his chest the way a man does at a graveside. "I heard what you just said, about what you'd do to any man who knew and stayed quiet. And you're right to have built it into your bones, son. A man ought to answer for a thing like that. So here." He spread his empty hands. "I'm the man. I'm the one who knew. My rifle's back in the grass, and I left it there on purpose. If 6 years of hating a faceless man in a crowd needs to land somewhere tonight, it can land on me, and I won't lift a hand against it, and I won't say one word to stop you. Your mother's got no gun in this cabin worth the name, and I'll not leave you two out here alone with Doyle stirred up. So I've got to stay. But I'll stay however you want me. As a witness, or as the man you make answer. That's your choosing, not mine. I gave up my right to choose anything the day I kept my mouth shut." The yard went dead silent. Samuel Vance stared at the big man standing bareheaded in his mother's lamplight, offering himself up with his hands spread and his rifle thrown away. And every plan the young man had ever built for this moment came apart in his hands. Because he'd imagined a man who'd deny it. Who'd make excuses. Who'd say he'd only been a boy, only been following orders, only been scared. He had not imagined a man who'd take off his hat and say, "I'm the one," and stand there waiting to take whatever came. 20 years, Samuel said, and his voice was shaking. "You had 20 years to come forward, to find us, to tell somebody, and you sat on a mountain." "Yes. My father died of a broke heart inside 2 years. 2 years, Mr. Hendricks, of being called a thief by every man in this valley, of watching his boy learn to be ashamed of him. And you knew the truth the whole time, and you sat on a mountain. Yes. Cole didn't flinch. Every word of that's true, and I'll say it again in the street tomorrow in front of the whole valley. If it'll help hang the man that did it, and I'll say it however many times you need to hear it. I'm not going to defend myself to you, Samuel. There's no defending it. I was a coward, and your father paid for my cowardice with his life, and your mother paid with her happiness, and you paid with your childhood, and there is not one thing I can do to give any of it back. His jaw worked. But I can help you finish him. Your mother tells me you've got 6 years of records, papers, ledgers, the whole scope of what Doyle's done to a dozen families. And you're right that a bought judge can call papers forged. But a bought judge has a harder time calling a living man a liar when that man stands up in the open street and says, I was there, I saw the ink dry. I worked for Harlan Doyle and I watched him do it. That's what I've got, son. 20 years too late, worth nothing to the man it should have saved. But it's yours. Take it. Use the coward to catch the devil. And when it's done, if you still want your reckoning off me, you'll know where the mountain is. Samuel Vance looked at the man a long moment. Then he looked at his mother, who was weeping silently, with her hand pressed to her mouth. Then he looked back at Cole, and something in the young man's face, some fever that had been burning in him for 6 years, seemed to gutter down, not out, but down-banked, made to wait. When it's done, Samuel said hoarse. When Doyle's hanged and my father's name is clean, then you and I will settle what's between us, Mr. Hendricks. I'm not saying what the settling will be. I don't know yet myself, but not tonight. Tonight I need the witness more than I need the reckoning. He drew a ragged breath. So put your hat back on, and come inside, because if we're going to do this tomorrow and do it right, then the three of us have got one night to make a plan that keeps my mother alive, and I've got a satchel of papers on my saddle that's going to change how you think this fight ends. Cole put his hat back on, and the three of them went into the cabin together, the widow, the son, and the coward. And Samuel Vance untied a heavy leather satchel from his saddle and set it on the table Cole had steadied with his own hands, and he began to lay out 6 years of a young man's secret war against Harlan Doyle, paper by paper in the lamplight, while his mother made coffee for the three of them, and the mountain man read over his shoulder. And what was in that satchel was worse and better than any of them had let themselves imagine. It was worse because the scope of Doyle's crimes laid out flat on a table was a monstrous thing. 20 years, a dozen families forged deeds and bought judges, and men run off their land, or run into their graves an empire built entirely of other people's ruin. Ruth had to leave the table twice. Once she found the name of a family she'd known, good people gone, now driven out the same year as the Vances, and she made a sound Cole had never heard a person make, and went and stood at the window until she could breathe. But it was better too, because Samuel had done the thing that Cole in 20 years and Ruth in 20 years had never had the means to do. He'd made it undeniable. Not a widow's grievance. Not one man's memory. A stack of copied records, cross-referenced, dated some of them in Doyle's own hand, some of them sworn statements bought quiet from men who'd worked the fraud and wanted out from under the weight of it. And the crown of it, the thing Samuel laid down last and heaviest, a set of railroad papers, showing that Doyle's whole present scheme. The thing he'd been so jumpy about all spring was a plan to sell the Stolen Valley bottomland to the railroad for a sum that would make him one of the richest men in the territory. Which meant the railroad's own lawyers, hard men with no love for Doyle, and every reason to want a clean title, would care very much to learn that the land Doyle was selling them had been got by forgery and murder. That's the piece, Samuel said, tapping the railroad papers. That's the piece I've been missing a way to use. Because you're both right, the court's bought. The sheriff's bought. Half the valley owes him money. If we bring this to Doyle's own court, he buries it same as always. But the railroad isn't his. The railroad's a bigger fish than Doyle ever dreamed of being, and the railroad does not want to buy a murdered man's land and find itself in 20 years of lawsuits. So we don't take this to the sheriff. His eyes were bright now, feverish, the plan he'd carried alone for years finally spoken aloud. We take it past him. There's a federal marshal riding circuit out of Helena and a territorial judge above every judge Doyle ever bought. And I've spent the last of my money getting word to both of them that something's coming. They can't act on a rumor, but they can act on this." He spread his hand over the satchel. "A living witness, a widow's testimony, 6 years of records, and a railroad deal that gives the whole territory a reason to care. That's not a grievance anymore. That's a case that reaches over Harlan Doyle's head to men he can't buy and can't scare." Cole looked at the young man across the lamplit table with something close to awe. "You planned all this," he said. "Alone. 6 years. I had to plan it alone. That was the whole trouble." Samuel's voice roughened. "I had the papers and no witness and no widow willing to be careful because my mother—" He glanced at Ruth, and it was not an accusation, it was almost tender. "My mother would have marched into Doyle's bank the day she got back and gotten herself shot for the satisfaction of calling him a murderer to his face. I couldn't tell her the plan because I couldn't trust the plan to survive her temper. And I had no witness at all. I'd near given up on finding one. And now, here you are." He shook his head slowly. "The one man alive who can swear to the first forgery, the one that started all of it. Do you understand what that means? Mr. Hendricks, every other family's ruin, Doyle can muddy. Different years, different clerks, papers that can be argued over. But ours was the first. Ours was the one he did with his own hands before he learned to be careful, before he had a bought court to hide behind. And you saw it. You're the crack in the foundation. Pull you out and I don't know if the case stands. Leave you in and it's unbreakable." So, and there it was, the thing that turned Cole's 20 years of cowardice in one sentence into the one indispensable thing. The very act that had shamed him, the standing in the office, the seeing the ink, the whole reason he'd hated himself into a decade of exile, it was the keystone. He'd spent 20 years believing his silence had made him worthless. And now the boy he'd wronged was telling him that his knowledge, the knowledge he'd buried, was the single load-bearing stone in the whole edifice of justice. Cole had to stand up and walk to the window himself then, and stand where Ruth had stood and get his own face under control. "All right," he said when he could. "Then here's what I think we do, and tell me where I'm wrong because you've thought on this 6 years, and I've thought on it 3 weeks." He came back to the table. "The gathering tomorrow, in the street. Your mother's already spread the word to the folk who owe Silas, and they mean to stand up. Now I said tomorrow we tell the truth in the open so Doyle can't twist it. But you've shown me something better. We don't just tell the truth. We tell it in front of witnesses in the open at church time when the whole valley's there, and we do it knowing the marshal and the judge are coming. So the street isn't the end of it. The street is where we make it impossible for Doyle to bury. 50 people hear the truth. Said plain, 50 people see the widow and the witness and the son stand up together, and then those 50 people can't unhear it. And when the marshal comes, he's not walking into a rumor. He's walking into a valley that already knows. He'll try to stop it." Ruth said quietly from the stove. "Doyle, when we start speaking, he won't stand there and let the whole valley hear it. He'll send his boys." "He will," Cole agreed. "And that's the danger, and I won't pretend it isn't. But there's 50 of us and a handful of them. And Doyle's power was never in his guns. It was in everybody being too scared to stand together. The minute they see the whole valley standing, half his boys will remember they've got neighbors too." He looked at Samuel. "It'll be close. Somebody could get hurt. Could be worse than hurt. I'll not lie to either of you about that. But I've made my peace with it, and I've sworn to your mother I'll see it through, and I'd rather die standing in that street tomorrow, saying a true thing, than live another 20 years on a mountain, having said nothing." Samuel studied him. "You mean that," he said. "It wasn't a question. You'd truly die for this." "I've been dead 20 years, son. Only difference is, now there's a reason worth spending the corpse on." And something moved across Samuel Vance's face. Then not forgiveness. It was too soon for that. And maybe it would never come, but something. A recognition. One man who'd given 6 years of his life to a hopeless war, looking at another man who'd give the last of his to end it. Two soldiers who'd fought the same enemy from opposite ends of the same long dark meeting at last in the middle. "There's one more thing you both need to know," Samuel said, and his voice dropped, and the fever came back into it. "And it's the thing I rode through the dark to tell my mother, and I've been circling it all night because I don't rightly know how to say it." He put both hands flat on the table. "Doyle knows something's coming. I told you that. He's been jumpy for weeks. But 2 days ago, he changed. He stopped being jumpy and started being calm, and Mama, that's worse, because a jumpy Doyle is a scared Doyle, but a calm Doyle is a Doyle who thinks he's found his answer. And I've been trying to figure what changed, what he found, what made him calm." He looked up and his face had gone gray. "And tonight, riding out here, I think I finally understood it. He's calm because he thinks he knows who the witness is. He thinks he's handled it. Because 2 days ago in his study half drunk, he told me proud of himself. The way he gets, he told me that old ghost off the mountain wasn't going to be a problem after all. That he'd sent men to make sure. That by Sunday there wouldn't be any witness for anybody to worry about." The cabin went absolutely still. "He sent men," Cole said slowly. "He sent men," Samuel said. "2 days ago. To the mountain. To handle the witness before Sunday." His eyes were wide. "Mr. Hendricks, where have you been the last 2 days?" And Cole Hendricks felt the floor tilt under him because he knew the answer, and the answer was that he had not been on his mountain the last 2 days. He'd been down in the valley, moving quiet from cabin to cabin, with Ruth spreading the word, riding home each night in the dark, and up again before light, spending almost no time at all at his own place on the ridge. Doyle's men had gone up the mountain to kill a witness who wasn't there. Which meant they'd found an empty cabin. Which meant they knew by now that the witness was somewhere else. Which meant that a calm Harlan Doyle, a Doyle who thought he'd handled his one problem, was about to learn that he hadn't handled it at all. And there was no telling what a man like that did when his false calm shattered. "They'll have found the cabin empty," Cole said. 2 days ago. They'll have reported back by now, which means Doyle knows I'm not on the mountain, which means he's looking for you," Samuel finished. "Right now, tonight, and the last place anybody's seen the widow Vance getting her firewood chopped is—" 3 heads turned toward the dark window at the same instant. And from somewhere down the valley road, faint but growing, came the sound that all 3 of them had been dreading without knowing. They dreaded it, the sound of horses. More than 3 this time. Many more. Coming up the road toward the cabin in the dead of night, coming fast, and coming together, the way men ride when they've stopped caring who hears them. And Cole Hendricks was already moving toward the rifle he'd left out in the grass, when Ruth Vance blew out the lamp and plunged the whole cabin into a darkness that suddenly felt very small, and very far from any help, and very full of the 3 people Harlan Doyle most needed dead before the sun came up on Sunday. In the dark, Cole Hendricks moved fast and low, and his voice came flat and certain the way it always did when everything else was falling apart. "Samuel, the satchel, every paper, where's your horse? Trees, east side, take it and go, not to town the ridge trail behind the woodshed up and over, don't stop till you're past the second creek." Cole was at the door now, easing it open a hand's width, listening. "Those papers are the whole war. Doyle can kill all 3 of us tonight, and if those papers reach the marshal, it doesn't save him. Do you understand me? You are the case, son, not me. Get the case out. I'm not leaving my mother. You're not leaving her. You're saving her. The only thing that keeps her breathing past tonight is those papers being somewhere Doyle can't reach, so he's got a reason to want her alive instead of dead. Now go." But Ruth Vance said quiet in the dark, "No." Both men turned. "He's not going anywhere," Ruth said. "And neither are you, Cole Hendricks, because if you think I'm going to stand in this cabin and let the 2 of you decide which of you dies for me, you've learned nothing about me in 3 weeks." She struck a match, just one low cupped in her hand, and in its little light, her face was the fiercest thing either of them had ever seen. "Those horses aren't Doyle's boys come to murder us quiet. Listen to them. They're not sneaking. They're not spreading out. They're riding straight up the road, bold as brass altogether. And men who mean to kill you in the dark don't announce themselves." So before we all die of our own plans, somebody had better go out on that porch and find out who's actually coming." And she blew out the match and walked to the door and opened it wide before either man could stop her. And she stepped out onto the porch. Cole had rebuilt with his own hands, a small silver-haired woman standing plain in the doorway of a dark cabin, while a dozen horses came pounding up her road. And she called out into the night in a voice that did not shake at all. "That's far enough. You're on Vance land, and the Vance land's got a shotgun in it, and you'll state your business before you come 1 foot closer." The horses slowed. They slowed, and they stopped. And out of the dark, a voice called back, and it was not Harlan Doyle's voice. And it was not the voice of any thick-necked boy. It was an old man's voice, cracked and reedy, and behind it came others, a woman's, a younger man's, a whole murmuring crowd of them. Ruth Vance, is that you?" "It's Aldous Finch. Put up your gun, girl, for God's sake. Half the valley's behind me." Ruth. Vance's hand went to the porch rail and gripped it hard, because it was not Doyle's men on the road. It was the storekeeper, Aldous Finch, and behind him the Petersons, and old Widow Hallett in a wagon, and a dozen more and more, coming the folk she'd ridden to all week, the folk who owed Silas Vance a 20-year debt of shame, and they had not waited for Sunday. They had come in the dark together because word had reached them that they could not sit still for. "Doyle's men rode into town not 2 hours ago," Aldous called, climbing down off his horse and hurrying toward the porch, breathless, an old man who had not moved this fast in years. Drunk and loud and looking for a mountain man, saying there'd be no witness come Sunday, saying they'd already been up the ridge and found the cabin empty and they'd find him tonight if they had to burn out every place in the valley to do it. He reached the porch steps and stopped, chest heaving. "And I stood in my own store, and I listened to them say it, Ruth. Same as I stood in that street 20 years ago and listened while they lied about Silas. And I thought I have been ashamed for 20 years, and I am 71 years old, and I will not carry it into the ground. So I closed my store, and I got on my horse, and I rode to every house I could reach, and I said, 'They're going to kill the witness tonight, and if we let them do it in the dark, then we're the same cowards we were 20 years ago.' And they came, Ruth. Look at them. They came." And Ruth Vance looked out at the road, and in the starlight she could see them, the wagons and the horses and the people on foot. 30 of them, 40 more arriving, even as she watched the whole quiet, ashamed heart of Cutbank Valley, risen up in the dark, and come to stand between Harlan Doyle and the man who could end him. Cole Hendricks came out onto the porch beside her, and Samuel came out on her other side, and the crowd on the road went murmuring at the sight of the big mountain man. The witness they'd all heard of alive and standing. And then someone lifted a lantern, and the light fell on Samuel's face, and old Widow Hallett cried out from her wagon, "Lord above, that's Silas's boy. That's Samuel Vance. He's the very spit of his father." And a sound went through the crowd then that Cole would remember to the end of his days. Not anger, not fear. It was the sound of 40 people, all recognizing at the same moment the son of the man they'd let be destroyed, grown come home standing on his mother's porch, and it was the sound of 20 years of buried shame finally breaking open into the open air. "They came for the witness," Ruth said. Her voice had gone thick. She was gripping the rail with both hands. "Cole, they came to stand for the witness." "No, ma'am," Cole said quietly. "They came to stand for Silas. 20 years late, same as me." Samuel Vance stepped down off the porch. He walked out to the edge of the crowd into the lantern light, and he stood where they could all see him. This young man who was the image of the dead man they'd wronged, and he lifted the leather satchel in his hand so it caught the light. "My name is Samuel Vance," he said, and his voice carried clear and hard across the whole dark road. "Not Reese. Vance. I took another name for 6 years because this valley made my fathers a curse, and I have spent every one of those 6 years and every dollar I ever earned gathering the proof of what Harlan Doyle did to my family, and to a dozen families like mine across 20 years in 3 counties. It's all here. Every forgery, every bought judge, every man he ruined, and every man he killed by ruining." He turned slowly so they could all see him. "And there is a witness. A man who worked for Doyle 20 years ago and saw the first forgery with his own eyes, The one that started all of it, the one Doyle did with his own hand before he learned to hide behind a bought court. That witness is standing on this porch. And come Sunday in the open street of this town in front of God, and everyone he is going to swear to what he saw. And I am going to lay these papers before a federal marshal and a territorial judge that Harlan Doyle cannot buy and cannot scare. And this valley is going to be free of him. His voice cracked at last. But not if we scatter tonight. Doyle knows the witness is off his mountain. He'll be looking. And the only thing on this earth that keeps him from murdering us all in the dark before Sunday ever comes is if we don't let ourselves be caught in the dark. If we stand together, right now, and don't stop standing together until it's done. For a long moment, the dark road was silent. Then Aldous Finch, 71 years old, took off his hat and said, "Then we'll stand. All of us. Right here tonight, and every night till Sunday, and Sunday too. Let Doyle send his boys. Let him come himself. He can't shoot the whole valley, not anymore. He only ever won because we let ourselves be alone." He turned to the crowd. "Well, we're done being alone, ain't we? We're done." And the crowd answered him. Not a cheer. It was too solemn a thing for a cheer, but a low, deep sound of 40 voices saying yes, saying we're done. And it rolled up off the road and over the cabin and up the black shoulder of the mountain, and Cole Hendricks stood on the porch he'd rebuilt and listened to a whole valley find its courage 20 years too late, and not one day too late, and he had to grip the rail himself to stay standing. Harlan Doyle's men came near dawn. They came the way Doyle's men always came, loud and sure, and expecting the dark to be empty. 6 of them with torches riding up the valley road toward the one cabin where they'd been told the witness might be hiding, and they came around the last bend and pulled up hard because the road was not empty. The road was full. 40 people stood across it in the gray First Light wagons drawn up wheel to wheel, and behind them on the cabin porch stood the widow, the son, and the mountain man, and not one soul among them moved or ran. The lead rider, one of the thick-necked boys from the street, sat his horse and stared, and his torch guttered in his hand, and he did not know what to do, because Harlan Doyle had sent him to frighten scattered people in the dark, and there was nothing scattered here, and the dark was going fast. "Go home," Ruth Vance called from the porch. "Go home and tell Harlan Doyle the valley's awake. Tell him the widow's got her son back, and the witness is alive, and half of Cutbank is standing in the road, and there's nothing in the dark for him to do anymore, because there isn't going to be any more dark. Sunday, we stand in the street. Tell him we'll be waiting. Tell him to bring his court, and his sheriff, and his lies, because this time the whole territory's going to be watching." The thick-necked boy looked at the 40 faces in the road. And he wheeled his horse and rode, and his 5 men rode with him back down the valley toward the man who'd sent them carrying the one piece of news Harlan Doyle had spent 20 years making sure he'd never have to hear, that the people were no longer afraid. Sunday came clear and hot. They came into Cutbank from every corner of the valley, and they did not come sneaking. They came in their wagons, and on their horses, and on their own 2 feet. And they filled the street in front of the church where they'd broken Silas Vance 20 years before. And at the center of them stood Ruth Vance in her thin gray traveling dress with her chin up, and beside her stood her son, and beside him stood Cole Hendricks with his hat in his hand. Harlan Doyle came too. He had to. A man cannot own a valley by hiding in his bank while the valley gathers in the street, and Doyle knew it. So he came with his bought sheriff and his soft, heavy face arranged into the confidence he'd worn for 20 years, and he pushed his way to the front of the crowd, meaning to break the thing up before it started the way he'd always broken things up. "This is unlawful assembly," Doyle announced loud to the sheriff, to the crowd, to the world. "Sheriff, I want this dispersed. These people are trespassing on the public street, Harlan." Ruth Vance's voice cut across him clear as a bell. In front of the public church on a Sunday. She turned to the crowd, and she did not raise her voice, and somehow that made it carry further. 20 years ago, you all stood right here, most of you. You stood here, and you watched them put my husband on his knees in this dirt and call him a thief. And you knew, some of you knew in your hearts, that it was a lie. And you said nothing. And Silas Vance died of it. She let that sit in the hot morning air. "I'm not here to shame you for it. God knows I've done my own share of things too late. I'm here because there's a man among you who can finally tell you the truth of what happened in this street, and I'm asking you just this once, to do the thing you didn't do 20 years ago. Listen, and when it's done, don't be silent." And she turned, and she looked at Cole Hendricks, and she said, "Tell them." Cole Hendricks stepped forward into the center of the street, into the exact place where Silas Vance had knelt, and he stood there, bareheaded in front of the whole valley, and the man who'd bought his silence, and for the first time in 20 years, he was not afraid. "My name is Cole Hendricks," he said. "Some of you know me as the man off the mountain, the one who never comes down, the one who never smiles. And you've wondered, I expect, what put me up there." His voice was steady, and it was terrible in its steadiness. "I'll tell you what put me up there. 20 years ago, I was 19 years old, and I worked for that man." He lifted his hand, and he pointed plain at Harlan Doyle. "And one night, the week before Silas Vance's trial, I was in his office, and I saw the water rights that they used to hang Silas's name. And the ink was still wet. Harlan Doyle forged them. I saw it. I knew it. It was not Silas Vance who forged one line of anything. It was that man sitting right there, and I watched him do it. And when they stood Silas up in this very street and called him a thief, I stood in that crowd with the truth in my mouth, and I swallowed it. Because I was young, and I was poor, and I was afraid of what he'd do to me." His voice did not break, but something behind it did. "And Silas Vance died believing no honest man in this valley knew he was innocent. That is the thing I have carried up that mountain for 20 years. That is the reason I never smiled. And I am standing in the spot where he knelt to tell you all too late for him, but not too late for the truth. Silas Vance was an innocent man, and Harlan Doyle is a forger and a thief and a murderer in all but the pulling of a trigger, and I will swear to every word of it before any judge in this territory." The silence in the street was the silence of 40 people not breathing, and then Aldous Finch from the crowd said, "I sold them the rope." His old voice shook. 20 years ago. Doyle's boys came into my store and bought the rope they carried in this street to scare Silas Vance, and I knew what it was for, and I sold it to them, and took their coin and said nothing. I've been ashamed every day since, and I say now before all of you Cole Hendricks is telling God's own truth. I saw enough to know it then. I was just too much a coward to say it. And then Widow Hallett. My Tom would be alive if Silas Vance had lived to help him work that flooded bottom. Silas saved my husband's life once. I never told a soul because Doyle held my mortgage. I'm telling it now. And then the Petersons. And then a man Cole didn't know. And then another. One by one, up and down the street, the people of Cutbank Valley stood up and said the true thing they'd been ashamed to say for 20 years, and each voice made the next one braver. And Harlan Doyle stood in the middle of it, turning slowly, watching his valley of frightened debtors transform in front of his eyes into 40 witnesses. And his soft, heavy face began at last to come apart. "Sheriff," Doyle said, and his voice had gone high and thin. "Sheriff, arrest that man, Hendricks. This is slander. This is a conspiracy. I'll have every one of you." "I don't believe he will, Mr. Doyle." The new voice came from the edge of the crowd, and it came from a man on a horse. A hard, lean man with a star on his coat that was not the bought tin star of Cutbank's sheriff, but a heavier, colder thing, and beside him rode an older man in a black coat with the look of a judge who had never in his life been bought and did not intend to start. The crowd parted for them. Samuel Vance had gotten his word out. The federal marshal out of Helena had come, and the territorial judge above every judge Doyle owned, and they had ridden into Cutbank, quiet at the back of the crowd, and heard the last 10 minutes of it with their own ears. "Harlan Doyle," the marshal said, swinging down off his horse. "My name doesn't much matter to you, but the paper in my saddlebag will. A young man named Samuel Vance sent word to Helena some weeks back that there was a fraud in this valley 20 years deep, and he had the records to prove it and a living witness besides. I came to see, was it true?" He looked around the street at the 40 faces, at the widow, at the son, at the mountain man standing in the place where Silas knelt. "I've heard enough standing here to know it's true. The records will settle the rest." Harlan Doyle, you're under arrest, and you'll answer for it in a court that sits in Helena a long way from any judge or any sheriff you ever bought." Doyle's bought sheriff took one look at the federal marshal and the territorial judge and unbuckled his own gun belt and set it in the dirt, because a bought man is loyal only as long as the buying holds, and Doyle's buying had just run out. And Harlan Doyle, the man who had owned a valley, who had built an empire out of forged deeds and broken families, who had ruled 20 years on the single certainty that everyone who could hurt him was too afraid to try, stood alone in the middle of the street. He'd ruled, and there was no one left to buy and no one left to frighten, and the whole valley watched the marshal put irons on his soft, heavy wrists. He didn't go quiet. Men like that never do. He was still shouting as they led him to a horse threats, promises, the names of powerful men, and not one soul in the street so much as flinched, because 40 people who have finally stopped being afraid have nothing left to give a man like Doyle, not even the satisfaction of their fear. And then he was gone down the road toward Helena between the marshal and the judge, and the street was quiet, and it was over. It was over. Samuel Vance turned to his mother, and for a moment neither of them moved. 20 years and 6 years, and one terrible lie all standing between them. And then Ruth Vance opened her arms, and her son came into them, this grown man who was the image of the husband she'd buried, and she held him in the middle of the street where his father had knelt, and she said into his shoulder over and over, "You never turned, you never turned, my boy never turned." And Samuel wept like the 14-year-old he'd been the day they'd run him out of this valley, and 40 people looked away to give them the privacy of it, and the July sun came down warm on the two of them holding each other at last. Cole Hendricks stood a little apart, hat in his hand, and watched them, and did not intrude, because a coward who'd helped break a family did not get to stand in the center of its mending. He'd said his piece. He'd told his truth. The keystone was pulled, and the empire was down, and Silas Vance's name was clean, and that was more than Cole had ever thought he'd live to give. He figured his work was done. He figured he'd get his horse and ride back up his mountain now, the way he'd always ridden back up his mountain, and let these good people have their valley back. He'd got as far as untying his horse when Ruth Vance's voice stopped him. "And just where," she said, "do you think you're going?" He turned. She'd come away from the crowd, her son a few steps behind her, and she was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Her chin up, her hands folded in front of her, the way she folded them. "Back up the mountain, ma'am," Cole said. "It's done. You've got your son. You've got your name back. You don't need the—" "If you say the word coward one more time, Cole Hendricks, I will take that shotgun to you myself." She walked up to him closer than she'd ever stood, right there in front of the whole valley, and she looked up into his weathered face. "You listen to me. 3 weeks ago you stepped out of a crowd that wanted me gone, and you were the only soul in 50 who did. You didn't know then that you owed me anything. You thought I was a stranger. You just saw a woman standing alone, and you couldn't bear it, and you stepped forward." Her voice thickened. "That's not what a coward does. A coward stays in the crowd. You stepped out of it. 20 years too late to save my Silas, maybe, but not too late to save me. Because I came back to this valley to die on a hill of an old man's honor, and instead I found my son, and I found the truth, and I found—" She stopped and steadied herself, and went on, "And I found a hard-headed mountain man who chops wood like he's angry at it, and won't take a cent, and holds a stirrup his mother taught him to hold. And I'll be damned if I'll stand here and watch him ride back up a mountain to be alone." The whole street had gone quiet again, watching. But Ruth Vance did not seem to care who watched. "You asked me a thing once," Cole said slowly. "On the porch, you said where was I 20 years ago, and I couldn't answer you then because the answer was too ugly. I know where you were 20 years ago." She reached up and she put her hand flat on his chest over the heart, the way she'd done once before. "I've made my peace with 20 years ago. It's gone. Silas is gone, and the man you were then is gone, and I'm too old to spend what's left of my life grieving things that are gone." Her eyes were bright and fierce and wet. "So I'm not going to ask you where you were 20 years ago anymore, Cole Hendricks. I'm going to ask you a different question. And I want a plain answer, because I've had my fill of men who won't say plain things." She took a breath. "Where are you going to be 20 years from now? Because I know where I mean to be. I mean to be right here in this valley on Vance land with my son close by and the name clean. And there's room on that land for a man who can mend a roof and clear a stovepipe and stand in a street and tell a hard truth. If he wants it. If he's done being alone." And Cole Hendricks looked down at the woman standing in front of the whole valley with her hand on his heart and at the son standing behind her, who gave him one slow nod. Not forgiveness, not yet, but permission. A door left open, and at the 40 people who'd found their courage 20 years late, and he understood that the mountain he'd hidden on for a decade had never once been a home. It had been a hiding place. A home was a thing you were brave enough to stand in the open for. "No, ma'am," he said, and his voice was rough. "I reckon I'm done being alone. Is that a plain answer?" "Plainest I've got." He put his hat back on his head, and then he took Ruth Vance's hand off his chest and held it in both of his big weathered ones right there in the street. "20 years from now, if you'll have me, I mean to be exactly where you are, mending your roof and chopping your wood and being buried when it comes to that, in this valley next to good people, with my name, my own, and my truth all told. I spent 20 years believing the best a man like me could do was hurt nobody by staying away from everybody. You cured me of that, Ruth Vance. You and your boy. You showed me the difference between being alone and being safe, and they were never the same thing at all." Ruth. Vance smiled at him. Then, full. No ghost of it, no killing it halfway. The first true smile he'd seen on her face in 3 weeks, and it took 20 years off her. "Well," she said, "it's about time." They were married that autumn in the church in Cutbank by a circuit preacher, with the whole valley crowded in to witness it. The Petersons and Widow Hallett and Aldous Finch, who gave the bride away, because there was no one living with a better right, and Samuel Vance standing up beside Cole as best man, which was its own kind of forgiveness, the kind that comes not in words, but in a man choosing to stand at your shoulder. Harlan Doyle was in a Helena prison by then, sentenced by the territorial judge on the strength of 6 years of a young man's records and 1 old man's testimony. And the valley bottom land went back to the families it had been stolen from, and the name Vance was spoken in Cutbank again, the way it had been meant to be spoken, with respect. Samuel stayed. He put his false name in the ground where it belonged, and he took the Vance land back, and he worked it, and he and Cole worked it together more often than not. 2 men who'd started as a wronged son, and the coward who'd wronged him and become across a season of hard, honest labor side by side. Something neither of them had a word for, but both of them counted on. Forgiveness, when it finally came for Samuel, did not come as a lightning stroke. It came the way the seasons come, slow and sure and unremarked. Until one day the young man looked at the old one across a field they'd cleared together and could not any longer remember what it had felt like to want him dead. And in the evenings, when the work was done, Cole Hendricks and Ruth sat out on the porch of the Vance cabin, mended now sound, now a real home now, and watched the light go long and gold across the valley they'd taken back. Sometimes Samuel sat with them. Sometimes half the valley did on a Sunday. And sometimes it was just the 2 of them, the mountain man and the widow who'd stopped being a widow, sitting close in the quiet with nothing that needed saying. One such evening late, with the first cool of autumn in the air, Ruth reached over and took Cole's hand, the way she'd taken it in the street, and she said, "You know what I keep thinking?" "What's that?" "That first afternoon, you standing in that street saying she's staying, and the whole town going silent." She squeezed his hand. "I thought you were a fool. I thought there goes a man about to lose everything for a stranger who'll only bring him grief." "You weren't wrong," Cole said. "I did lose everything. Lost my mountain, lost my hiding place, lost 20 years of being safely, comfortably dead." He turned his hand over and folded her small, strong fingers into his. "Best losses I ever took." Ruth Vance laughed low and warm, and leaned her silver head against the shoulder of the man who'd chopped her firewood, and they sat together on the porch in the gold and gathering dark. An old woman the whole town had once cast out, and an old man who'd been too afraid to smile, and the truth of what they'd made between them was as plain and as solid and as true as the mended cabin at their backs. Home was never the mountain. Home was never even the land. Home was the person who chose to stay and who was worth being brave for. And Cole Hendricks, who had spent 20 years believing he'd used up all his courage in one act of failing to speak, had found at the far end of his life that there had been enough left in him all along to build a whole new one. He had stepped out of the crowd, and it had cost him everything, and it had given him back the only thing that had ever mattered. The woman everyone rejected became the woman the whole valley came to for wisdom. The man who never smiled, smiled every single morning of the rest of his life. And Silas Vance rested easy at last, in a valley that finally knew the truth of him, watched over by a wife who'd kept faith, a son who'd come home, and a one-time coward who'd learned 20 years too late, and exactly in time, that the bravest thing a broken man can do is let himself be loved, and love back, and stay.